Let's rewind to 2003 when the US government was convinced Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction. WMDs, a term that dominated headlines and justified fear. Secretary of State Colin Powell took the world stage at the UN, holding up a vial and insisting Iraq had mobile biological weapons labs. The evidence? Satellite photos of trucks, dramatic claims, and sources with names like Curveball, hardly reassuring. UN inspectors, led by Hans Blix, searched Iraq and found nothing, but their empty hands were spun as proof of Saddam's cunning. The narrative was relentless. Saddam was a monster with doomsday weapons, and only the US could stop him. The public was told invasion was a necessity, not a choice, a preemptive strike to prevent a mushroom cloud. But the so-called evidence was a mix of outdated info, wishful thinking, and outright fabrications. The administration repeated the WMD story until it became fact, selling a war on a foundation of sand. The world bought it, and the US prepared for war. In reality, the case was built on garbage intelligence and fear-mongering. The cost? Thousands of lives, trillions of dollars, and the biggest lie of the 21st century. The ghost in the bottle was just that, a ghost, and the world would pay dearly for chasing it. To understand the Iraq invasion, you have to remember, Saddam Hussein wasn't always America's villain. In the 1980s, the US saw him as a useful ally against Iran, even sending Donald Rumsfeld to shake his hand in Baghdad. America provided Saddam with intelligence, economic aid, and even components for weapons, ignoring his brutal tactics. But everything changed in 1990 when Saddam invaded Kuwait, threatening global oil supplies. The US led a coalition to drive him out but stopped short of removing him from power. Instead, sanctions and weapons inspections kept Saddam contained for a decade. He was a problem, but a managed one, until a new crisis gave a new administration a reason to act. The US shifted from containment to regime change, painting Saddam as the ultimate threat. The irony? The same officials who once supported him now led the charge to take him down. The villain in the box was unleashed, not by his own actions, but by shifting American interests. The stage was set for a new war, built on old alliances and fresh fears. Saddam's transformation from ally to enemy was less about his actions, and more about America's changing priorities. The world watched as history was rewritten in real time. Yesterday's friend became today's target, and the consequences would be global. September 11, 2001, changed everything. America's grief and anger demanded action. The immediate target was Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but some in the Bush administration saw a bigger opportunity. They began linking Saddam Hussein to 9/11s despite zero credible evidence. The public was told Saddam and Al-Qaeda were allies, even though they were ideological enemies. This narrative fused the fear of terrorism with the push for war in Iraq. Intelligence was cherry-picked, doubts erased, and the case for war was built on shaky ground. The administration sold the invasion as self-defense, not a choice. The WMD story and the 9/11's connection became inseparable pillars of the war's justification. The emotional trauma of 9/11's was weaponized to silence dissent and rush to war. Reports full of caveats were presented as certainty. The public, still reeling from tragedy, was primed to believe the worst. The Iraq War was marketed as preventing the next 9/11's. In reality, it was a masterclass in political manipulation. The real threat was never Saddam, it was the narrative itself, and the world would soon learn the cost of believing it. March 20, 2003. Operation Iraqi Freedom began with shock and awe. A display of overwhelming force broadcast worldwide. US troops swept through Iraq, toppling Saddam's regime in weeks. President Bush declared mission accomplished just 6 weeks later, confident the war was won. But the real mission, finding WMDs, was just beginning. Teams scoured Iraq, following every lead, searching every bunker. They found nothing, no chemical stockpiles, no mobile labs, no nuclear program. The much-hyped evidence evaporated. The Iraq Survey Group's final report was clear. Iraq had no active WMDs. Saddam's programs had been dismantled years earlier. The central justification for war was gone. The world watched as the rationale for invasion collapsed. The ghost in the bottle was exposed as a myth. The war's premise had vanished, but the consequences were just beginning. The US had won the battle, but lost the narrative. The cost of chasing shadows would haunt the world for years. Mission accomplished? Not even close. If WMDs and 9/11s weren't the real reasons, what was? Follow the money, specifically oil. Iraq sits atop the world's second-largest oil reserves, a buried fortune. Before the war, Saddam threatened U.S. interests by planning to sell oil in euros, not dollars. The invasion ended that threat and opened Iraq's oil fields to Western companies. Contracts worth billions went to U.S. and U.K. oil giants locked out under Saddam. The war, sold as security, became a business opportunity. Compare Iraq to North Korea. The latter had real nukes but no oil, so no invasion. Iraq was a softer, richer target. The logic was simple. Oil meant power, and power meant profit. The war's true beneficiaries weren't the Iraqi people, they were the corporations cashing in. The real story was written in oil. The cost of the Iraq War is staggering. For Iraqis it meant hundreds of thousands dead, cities destroyed, and millions displaced. Sectarian violence exploded, turning daily life into a nightmare. The promise of freedom became chaos, as institutions collapsed and warlords filled the void. For Americans, nearly 4,500 troops died, tens of thousands were wounded, and a generation was scarred. The financial cost? Over $2 trillion, money that could have rebuilt lives at home. The war's only winners were a handful of politicians and corporations. Mission accomplished became a symbol of tragic irony. The war was sold on a lie and paid for in blood and treasure. The consequences rippled far beyond Iraq's borders. The true price was measured in lives lost and futures destroyed. The disaster would echo for generations. Toppling Saddam created a power vacuum, and chaos rushed in. The U.S. had no plan for peace, only for war. Sectarian violence erupted and insurgents flourished. Out of this chaos, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was born, more brutal than before. When U.S. troops withdrew, the vacuum remained. Al-Qaeda in Iraq evolved into ISIS, a terror state that shocked the world. ISIS was forged in the fires of the Iraq War, led by former regime officers and fueled by Sunni anger. The U.S. returned to fight the monster it had helped create. The war meant to make America safer unleashed a new global threat. The legacy was not freedom, but instability and terror. 2 decades later, the truth is clear. No WMDs, no 9/11's link, no justice. The war's architects faced no consequences, just book deals and speaking tours. Regret replaced accountability. Apologies were rare and empty. The U.S. avoided any real reckoning, shielding its leaders from prosecution. The world's trust in American intelligence and leadership was shattered. Allies felt betrayed, and public faith in government plummeted. The war changed how the world saw America, not as liberator, but as reckless empire. No national commission, no war crimes trials, just silence. The Iraq War is a cautionary tale about fear, manipulation, and unchecked power. It's a story of how truth was sacrificed for ambition. The central question remains, have we learned anything, or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes? The silence from those responsible is deafening.